welcome to FinOps for Finance. Today we're going to talk about the ever-evolving field of GreenOps. So as you may know, the cloud is a bundle of data centers that other people own. These data centers need to be powered and cooled. And I read recently it's about 2% of global power, and James might be able to correct me, runs on data centers. So there's obviously an environmental impact on everything that's going there. So we've really good information in the cloud in terms of what we're spending. The information when it comes to what impact that's having on the planet is not so good. And that's where GreenOps comes in. It's measuring the impact of the cloud on the planet. I only know a very small piece about it. And if you dig deeper questions, I'll be lost very quickly. So that's why I've got James Hall from GreenPixie to chat to us today to tell us a little bit more. James, could you tell us a bit about yourself and how GreenPixie is leading the charge and helping drive accountability and visibility into the global impact of cloud?
Yeah, well, I mean, GreenPixie, our mission is essentially to kind of power this green ops movement. Essentially, what we found is really the problem. Green ops itself is quite intuitive. You know, you need to reduce your usage, reduce consumption, ultimately reduce electricity and CO2, and start taking the CO2 impact into account. But the real problem is like, where's the data to prove that we're doing this, to make the decisions? And that's really what GreenPixie are trying to do. And I'm head of GreenOps at GreenPixie, and ultimately my job is to not only work on the methodology, work with the FinOps people of the FinOps Foundation to make our data as useful as possible, but also, you know, show people the art of the possible. What is possible when you look at your usage through a CO2 or carbon or electricity or water lens? How can you make different decisions off the back of the data, not just looking at it from a cost perspective?
You make a really interesting point, and the bit that I always forget about is water. Like you think of data centers and you think of all the power, but you forget the fact that so much water is used for the cooling of these data centers, and obviously there's a lot of talk about the impact of that and what that'll have down the line. That's and measuring something like that is a really complex
Not to
piece.
be a doomsayer, but you know, yes, there is a climate crisis. We all know that, but there's an energy crisis and there's a water crisis. So you really need to be looking at all these different metrics because, you know, in the US, maybe they're not that bothered about CO2 metrics for regulation, but you know, they have horrible droughts and rivers are drying up. So, you know, what people care about is really different depending on geography and their personal beliefs. So you really got to be aware of all these different things.
Yes, yeah, because when you think of water and you're based in the UK, it doesn't seem too much of an issue when
Yeah,
it's
too much of
lashing
a
rain
stuff. Yeah.
outside. Whereas this CO2 piece with the inverted commas summer we're having, you can see that impact, and it's the river in Colorado that's completely drying up by the time it gets to the end of it, and that's a really important point. And then when you're thinking about green ops from a beginner's perspective, because I suppose this show is aimed at people just very new to FinOps and trying to figure out what their way in it. How does it matter, or how can they? What's a good way for someone just brand new to start thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, well, maybe counterintuitively to what you might think, it's not just about reduce your emissions at all costs. It's actually more about how do you add carbon impact to the thought process, to the trade-off process, to how your cloud strategy is growing. Because you know, if you know you're about to reserve an instance and it's going to be 100 tons, but you decide this is exactly what our business needs. You know, having that awareness, you know, typically people start at just the observability and awareness. You know, it doesn't go straight into how do I change my cloud strategy for sustainability. It's like, how do I understand the numbers and the impact of what we're doing or what we've already done? And, you know, just start adding that into the regular cadence, into the KPIs, getting that data in front of the right people. You know, it doesn't need to start off with like, we need to shut all these instances down and re-architect to Graviton and to Lambdas and serverless just because we want to save CO2. But and most companies will probably stay in observability and just measuring for quite a long time before really actioning it. But it is because of that overlap between FinOps and GreenOps and shutting things down, you know, it can really be quite quite easily melded into the things you're already doing. And that's kind of how we kick people off initially, is where do we find the overlap between what you're already doing and how do we get the data as part of the decision process?
Yeah, because it's like say there's a really strong correlation there because if FinOps is looking to save costs by using less and GreenOps is looking to save CO2 and water by using less, there is a lot of similar thing. And I suppose in a way it's another carrot to when you're having discussions with engineers, you might say, well, by turning off this instance, you're saving $20 an hour, or by turning off this instance, you're saving the equivalent of 50 trees or however many liters of water. And as you said, even about the water or the CO2, the way it impacts different geographies, the more motivation I suppose you can give to someone to make the right decision, because people generally they want to do the right thing. No one goes to write ineffective code, or it's just busy in matters of priority. So by having that information, I suppose it allows people to make that decision and prioritize their day-to-day piece.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the myths I bust early on when I'm engaging with a company. It's like GreenOps isn't another thing to worry about. It's another tool in the FinOps practitioner's tool belt to try and get the narrative across that efficiency matters and frugality matters, but not every single engineer will care about saving, you know, pinching pennies, and their KPIs are around performance and making sure there's no latency. But how do you then introduce the idea of, okay, now we need to start using our usage a bit more responsibly? The FinOps team had their cost KPIs, but how can they tell a different story using water, CO2, trees to kind of get a mutually beneficial outcome for everyone?
Yes, yeah. Because I suppose a couple of dollars, it just gets lost in the P&L and balance sheet, and they're like, well, I can't, that doesn't really mean anything to me in the business context, but 10 trees, I know what that is, and I know what impact that would, because everyone has those company wellness days where you go off and you hug a tree and you clean a beach and you do this sort of thing. But if you can have even a greater impact by tweaking code, I suppose that is quite meaningful.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, developers have enough things to worry about,
Oh,
really,
100%. Yeah.
And,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
I always
then
think that,
typically in the tech company, the product is the most revenue generating thing in the whole business. So, don't ask me. I'm making this company's money. Don't tell me to start,
yeah.
putting extra hours into right sizing. I've got better things to do. But how can you change that way of thinking and that narrative with cloud sustainability and green ops is kind of one of the approaches we take and one of the benefits that we shout about.
Because I suppose an engineer will never get shouted if their application is maybe 5 or 10% more expensive. They're not really going to get in that much bother. But if it falls over and is in production, that's the issue then, and it's such a balancing act. And at least this helps elevate the conversation, maybe in terms of priorities. Um, cool. And then in terms of like getting started with the observability piece, I know different cloud vendors provide, and I know there are various elements included and excluded from the numbers they report. But if someone was looking to kind of even get a baseline, is that is there a way to kind of get started on that before moving to something more advanced?
Yeah, well, there are quite a few data sources out there, all with their pros and cons. Like if you look at the cloud provider data, they will include something called the market-based calculation, which ultimately is like how many how much green electricity have they purchased on the other side of the planet to then claim that it's going into their, Texas data center and things like that. And that's a valid way of reporting, arguably, from an ESG perspective. But when it comes to like the usefulness of the data, say you do a huge right sizing project, if you go and look at your dashboard in the cloud native provider, you've maybe gone from arguably from like zero carbon to zero carbon because they'll say it's 100% renewable. And, maybe that makes your ESG report looks nice, but if you're trying to get people to build more efficiently for other reasons like cost or or the electricity or the water, then that kind of data isn't particularly useful. So you really need to understand what are the requirements of your data. Like how do you get numbers in the right order of magnitude that tell the right story that you want to tell. And a lot of people have problems with the cloud native tools because of no granularity or no timeliness. And when you're an engineer or a FinOps guy, you become pretty used to the daily data that goes down to like hourly, every single resource you can possibly know. That's the kind of data they need. And so that essentially became the Bible for Green Pixie and how do we make carbon data match this level of fidelity, because we knew that's what essentially the people we need to engage, that's the data they're used to. So how do we copy that?
It's a really good point because it's kind of like if you're getting an overall score, you're like, oh, we're here and but how do we change that? Because it's kind of like looking at the environmental impact on a global perspective. If I recycle myself, what impact does that have if the lad next door is burning his rubbish every so it exactly like FinOps where you've got tagging and like you say that observability to a granular level because well these BUs are really taking it seriously and driving the initiative, and this BU is spending money hand over fist and unless you can compare at that granular level, it is quite difficult. And the point you make about the green energy and the credits and I suppose greenwashing, for want of it,
Yeah,
that's quite rife. Everyone says they're net zero, but how many credits are they buying from Nicaragua and places like this, and how many times is the same forest or tree being used as a carbon piece? So that's an
that's
interesting
why
point.
I really like the electricity as a number, because carbon, I think it's kind of become a bit of a vanity metric, really. You can just kind of shift and lift and shift your architecture to France or Sweden, and reduce 99%. But what that won't help is the energy crisis that's happening in both these countries, or the water crisis in these countries. And it stops it from being creative accounting. You just like can't. It's almost like electricity is the non-fungible token of your usage. And I think that is where, with AI coming in, and how
Yeah.
GPUs are energy suckers, it's really going to be the energy crisis that overtakes the climate crisis ultimately.
Yes, yeah. And that's when people really sit up and take notice. But by having the observability in place beforehand, at least you know, okay, this thing is costing me a load of power, but there's a ration. This is something we need, or this
Yeah,
is something we don't need. And even in terms of the
exactly.
size of boxes as well, I suppose you could have a large number of smaller sizes, or you could consolidate them into a bigger machine. And from an efficiency point of view, which I suppose is from a cost perspective is where the differential probably is because I suppose they cost the same, the sum of the parts versus the console, but from an energy perspective, it's stuff like that might start to make more of a difference.
Yeah, well, like before you make any choice in the cloud, you need to do a cost benefit analysis of like how much time is it going to take, and this is the cost. And I think cloud green ops or cloud sustainability, or like, it comes in many names, but it's just about the ability to do that carbon benefit analysis ultimately. Whatever choice you decide to make on the other side is kind of up to you, but at least it means you can now take into account what's the impact on our net zero goals, what's the impact on our scope 3 reduction targets, or on our public image if we were to do this, and is there potentially a better option if we put a bit more thought into it. And if you decide there's no better option, then great, well done. You've done some informed ignoring. I'm happy
Yeah,
for you. But
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 at
if
least you
there
know.
is, yeah, at least there will be no nasty surprises in
Yeah.
2 years' time when someone is forcing you to measure this stuff, and you see the carbon bill is enormous.
This was the cost of because everyone's driving for net zero carbon credits and the price of that sort of stuff is going up. Whereas if you can measure your stuff more effectively, instead of taking an average or whatever it is, you can say, well, this is my actual number and I'm impacting it. And from a finance and accounting perspective, I suppose they can understand then that puts a dollar, not only is saving the planet and like say something nice to say, you can also say, well, from a dollar perspective, it impacts us. And then in terms of like from a FinOps person's perspective, upskilling to kind of bring green ops into into your kind of wheelhouse, so to speak, is there much upskilling or much effort involved in kind of bring that in, or what are your thoughts or your guidance on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd say GreenOps is actually really quite intuitive. There's someone who is already putting best practices in place that monitor usage, that make sure people are on the right storage tier. If you're implementing auto scaling or auto storage tiering by default, you are effectively doing GreenOps, to be honest. But it's that kind of the data that helps you show that story or tell that story, or lets you kind of see the impact of doing this, because you can go online and see the carbon impact of all these different storage. I mean the cost impact of all these different instances in different regions, and whether you how many hours you like cost per hour, and of all these different things you can do in the cloud. But there's no equivalent to carbon, so there's just no planning. There's no kind of carbon benefit analysis. There's no looking back and seeing, oh, I made a change, what actually happened from an energy and carbon perspective. And that is what Green Pixie want to do, because there are practitioners out there much cleverer than me at reducing their usage, but what they're not doing, or what they've not had given to them, is the data to enable them to do the green ops. And that's where we want to really help people.
Yeah, because like I said, there's a million and one things that people could be doing, engineers and FinOps practitioners, because there's so much. Like once you've got the low-hanging fruit, then it's having the conversations and bringing meaningful recommendations. But you don't have time to enrich all the data. So yeah, the tooling and the enrichment is a big part of it. If you can save that lift, it means you have quicker time to insight and action, I suppose.
The usage reports, they're not really usable by humans at all.
Yeah,
It's like hundreds of rows. I mean, hundreds of columns, millions of rows. You know, if you're not getting a machine to do that stuff, you're going to really really struggle. And that's kind of what our technology does basically, is use that to get the data source, to get it inside the dashboards or the tools that the FinOps people are already using, in a way that they recognize it. But we're just changing the metrics. So I guess back to the question of upskilling, there'll be some terminology you might need to learn: scope one, two, and three, market based versus location based. Um, but the rest, I feel, is really quite intuitive. And actually, the FinOps Foundation, I've been working with them on a glossary of sustainability terms and things like that. So you can actually, that'll be a resource directly in the FinOps training, I think, in the future, which is really promising to see.
because I know they redid the framework, and sustainability is kind of one of those pieces that are next to the core personas
Mm.
within it. So it's great that it's getting the recognition at that level as well. I think there's a couple of working groups that are doing a bit of work around sustainability as well,
Yeah,
which is
yeah,
cool.
I'm a big part of those working groups as well. And what I like the way the FinOps Foundation are doing it is, like, you won't catch them saying the word green ops, because from their perspective, they're putting cloud sustainability in the default FinOps framework. So, if you are reading about unit economics or optimization on the FinOps website, you'll start seeing cloud sustainability pop up on everything. It's not like a new practice. It's how do we get it ingrained in everything we're already doing, which I think is a nice approach.
And I suppose some of the practices and the efforts that are going on from a public cloud perspective, the fact that the private cloud's observability is getting much better now, because it has to, because people are used to getting this level of granularity from a public cloud. Hopefully, there'll be some of that cross pollination of the sustainability element, and the SaaS providers as well, I know, are coming on stream as well. So the the future is bright, I suppose, in the pipeline in terms of getting that, because information is power, but it's as you mentioned, too much information is an awful lot. It's kind of like
Yeah.
drinking from the fire hose. You don't know what to make sense of. So having a machine to try and kind of at least cleanse it and make it more relevant,
Mm.
so you can dig into the insights.
When you add the complexity as well of all these people having different methodologies. It's like having a data feed that's in dollars and one in yen and one in euros, but you just have no idea which is which or what conversion factor to use on any of them. So it really is kind of hopeless out there for people trying to do it without the help of, someone like Green Pixie to try and really normalize that data, get it in a way they recognize and actually kind of make it readable for them. So yeah,
And repeatable as well, I suppose, is a key
yeah,
thing. Once you know what the data is going to look like, you can build the tooling and the reporting to feed that in and give people a consistent view. Because I suppose it's all well and good giving people information on a baseline, but if they take an action, they need to know how that action has impacted. How has it moved the dial per
yeah.
big element?
Yeah, because if your cloud native dashboard goes down 20%, is it because they just bought some more PPAs, or is it because you actually did something interesting? And then that they'll also have like a month or 3 month delay on the you making the change to the actual data in there. You've probably forgotten what you did by the 3 months of time.
Yeah.
So it really does become a struggle to make that action to consequence relationship, which is what people need to actually trust the data.
And that granularity that we spoke about as well, you can see at my BU level, what am I influencing? It's like organizational goals. They can make a goal up here, but you have to flow that down to make it relevant to people so that they can take an action that drives the desired output at that level. So that's really cool. And,
Yeah.
and then as a kind of data person myself, I love digging into the metrics to kind of get kind of an understanding. And I know we don't want to get kind of completely lost in the weeds, but I'm just wondering how is the CO2 calculated kind of on a machine basis just to try and make it real to some so they get a feel for what actually goes into this because I know there's a bit involved.
Yeah, so our methodology is kind of based around the usage report. So there's a lot of detail in there, but you're also a little bit at the mercy of what are they choosing to give you in those reports and what are they saying online. But I mean, like for individual instance types, for example, like if they're using an Intel chip, there is performance information around what those Intel chips and their energy consumption curve is across a series of utilizations. And you can start using this data to kind of reverse engineer. Okay, this instance types is using this one. It's got this many vCPU cores. If you get the full maximum amount of reservations you can for memory and vCPUs, and then it becomes interesting things around virtualization. So, okay, you're at 25% utilization. You've shotgunned 12% of it, and how can you kind of break down that hour of usage of that instance types based on how much you've reserved? And then you kind of start getting, okay, so this is what a kilowatt hour per hour of these things would be. And kind of what we've done is almost for every SKU we see or every type of usage, how do we get a kilowatt hour per hour value for that kind of usage? And yeah, it does become a bit of a black box, and you do need to start making assumptions, but you can't let perfection get in the way of any progress. If you're waiting for the perfect number, then you're never going to get anywhere. But the way we get around that is just being, complete transparency over everything we do, and that's how you really build trust in the data. But yeah, once you've got that kilowatt hour number, then it becomes a matter of, okay, what grid coefficients am I going to use? Do I like electricity maps? Do I have, the International Electricity Agency? And you can actually work with internally, like no doubt your sustainability team will actually have pre-approved ones that they like to use, but then there's sources out there that let you get down to hourly data where you can think, oh, if I time shift a bit, that could actually affect my CO2. So there's two facets of it. It's how do you work out electricity, then how do you turn that electricity into CO2, which which is kind of the two steps.
That's really cool. I hadn't even thought about the peak versus on-peak, but I suppose when you think about your own electricity bill, there's obviously a difference when there's the pull on the grid versus not. So if you schedule some batch loads to run off peak, for example, or something like that, that's a really interesting point. And I suppose it ties in with maybe spot instances and stuff like that, which would probably be the lull period in terms of the when the draw on the grid is, because you wouldn't have the same, although maybe not directly, but there might be some correlation there as well. Just thinking from a cost perspective, where it can benefit even further.
Yeah.
No, James, that's been really, really interesting. Learned an awful lot, and really appreciate your time. If people are looking to get in touch and learn a bit more about GreenOps and everything that you and the guys in Green Pixie are doing, how can they get in touch?
Yeah, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. You can come and find me. There's about a million James Halls, but if you look at James Hall Green Pixie, you should be able to find me. Otherwise, head to greenpixie.com and fill out our contact form. We'd be happy to talk you through what we're doing with other customers, like UK government, and kind of what we're doing, the work in there, or go into our methodology, or just kind of show you, or just talk about shoot the shit around GreenOps. Yeah, if that's what you like to talk about.
Sounds great. And I'll put the link to your profile and Green Pixie in the notes of the show as well, so people can check that out if they want to get in touch. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Donald.